Now take the opportunity to just say a few words in advance of our academic keynote. Few, if any, names are as recognizable in the area of gender and development as Naila Kabeer's. Dr. Kabeer, Professor of Gender and International Development at the London School of Economics and Political Science, is one of the greatest contemporary thinkers in international development with an extensive portfolio of research contributions. With 12 authored, co-authored, or edited books, far too many journal articles to count, and I tried, and Professor Kabeer has revolutionized the way we think about gender, poverty and vulnerability, and inclusive development. Her groundbreaking work on gender, labor markets and livelihoods, microfinance, social exclusion, social protection and collective action is ubiquitous in the scholarly literature. Highly cited, a Google citation count, by the way, this morning, I'm sure it's changed already, counts no fewer than 19,265 citations. Her work is listed on course outlines across many disciplines and universities around the world, and including here at McGill. Her widely read and cited book, Reverse Realities, Gender Hierarchies and Development Thought, is a centerpiece for understanding the entrenched biases prevalent in development theory and practice, and the marginalization of women within and beyond the household or family unit. Her work on resources, agency, and achievements has defined the modern research agenda on women's empowerment, indeed defined the concept of women's empowerment itself. Professor Kabeer's more recent publications include Organizing Women in the Informal Economy, Beyond the Weapons of the Weak, Intersecting Inequalities and the Sustainable Development Goals, Insights from Brazil, and Women Workers in the Politics of Claims Making in a Globalizing Economy. Now, in her spare time, she is on the editorial board of a few journals: Feminist Economics, Development and Change, Gender and Development, Third World Quarterly, and the Canadian Journal of Development Studies. She advises and collaborates with practitioners and policymakers, IDRC, World Bank, UNDP, UNIFEM, NORAD, SIDA, the Swedish one, Oxfam, and with Bangladeshi NGOs such as BRAC, Pradhan, and Open Society Foundations. International Center for Human Rights, for International Center for Research on Women, and on the advisory committee of the ILO's Better Works program. Still spare time, right? President-elect of the International Association for Feminist Economics. And most importantly, through her research, teaching, and policy, Professor Kabeer is a staunch advocate for women and marginalized populations around the world. Professor Kabeer, on behalf of ISID and McGill University, I extend a most heartfelt welcome and thank you most sincerely for being here today.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very, I liked that introduction. It's always nice to hear these nice things about oneself. So what I'm going to do today is speak from a paper that I'm currently writing, and which is a kind of a follow-up to a paper I did earlier for IDRC, and that is published by McGill as a part of their working paper series. And that paper was really looking very much at gender and inequalities in the labor market. And so it was a kind of precursor to ideas around women's economic empowerment. And what I'm doing today is talking from a current effort to really pull together the literature that there is on assessing efforts to build women's livelihood capabilities, and to ask ourselves what we can learn from that literature about an agenda for women's economic empowerment. So it's commissioned by Gage, and they're very keen, I should let you know about Gage, which is a 9-year program which will be looking at global adolescence, which will be looking at adolescents across the world, adolescent girls, but also boys, because as we pointed out earlier, one cannot be understood without the other. And the working paper will come out very soon. If it had been out already, we would have circulated it. So I'm going to look, once again, at economic empowerment and trying to develop a theory of change, and the extent to which such a theory of change should be sensitive to certain variations, including variations across the life course. And then I want to just go through what this literature assessing livelihood, efforts to build livelihood capabilities, tells us about roadblocks to change, and then pathways to change, because I always like to be a little bit optimistic, and then I'll conclude with a few comments, and I hope by then it'll be time for the reception. So, empowerment, as I've defined before, refers to the processes by those who have been denied the ability to exercise strategic forms of choice, voice, and influence in their personal lives and the wider community are able to gain this ability. Now, if we elaborate the processes by which this happens, we get a very rudimentary three-dimensional theory of change, which links women's access to resources to their capacity to exercise strategic forms of agency in order to achieve valued outcomes. So that's a very basic, a very rudimentary, a very linear model of change. In order to make this relevant to an economic empowerment agenda, I'm focusing very much on livelihood outcomes. What are the resources that women need to improve their livelihoods? And the interventions that I've looked at include a range of different kinds of resources broadly defined. Human resources such as labor, time, knowledge, soft skills and hard skills, and information. Material resources such as credit, paid work, land, and so on, and social resources such as access to influential people or connections with each other. And by agency, I'm referring to a number of different things: the cognitive capacity for reflection, analysis, and setting goals, the practical capacity to achieve these goals, and also a subjective capability which reflects how women view themselves and their place in society, their sense of agency, their sense of self-worth, their capacity to have dreams. However, and the minister pointed this out, when we look at the progress that we have made on gender equality in the last whatever number of years, we find that actually progress has been extremely uneven. And according to the World Economic Forum report on global gender gaps, we have made far greater progress at the global level in closing gender gaps in health and education. And these are capabilities that were supposed to contribute to women's participation in the economic domain. But as you can see, on health and education at the global level, we've closed over 95% of the gender gaps. But in terms of the economy, only 60% of the gender gaps. And of course, we won't even look at political participation, where we have closed only 23% of the gaps. So this very slow translation of human capabilities into economic participation suggests that those resources on their own are not sufficient. And so what I think we need to do is to, into that very basic model of change, we need to factor in some of the structures that block the process of translation. And by these structures of constraint, I divide them into some of those values, customs, norms, etc., that are embedded in the intrinsically gendered relations of family and kinship and community, and that have been around with us for many, many, many years, perhaps generations, perhaps centuries. And these are norms, values, and customs, etc., which define what masculinity and femininity means in a society, and what masculinity and femininity, what kinds of activities it's associated with. So as we all know, it gives primary responsibility for unpaid work within the family and kinship to women and girls. It requires men to be the primary breadwinners, but in different parts of the world, women may also share breadwinning responsibilities. B, of course, it determines what kinds of activities are suitable for men and women. So in India, for instance, women are not supposed to touch the plow, which means they never do any plowing. And in Africa, we have things like women's crops and men's crops and so on. These traditional norms and values also determine what kind of property people receive, inheritance structures and so on. And finally, of course, the fact that they have remained so resilient reflects the fact that they are not really about family and kinship at all. They are societal ideologies. And they are frequently reproduced by the so-called impersonal institutions of state, markets, and civil society. So we have got, and the World Bank and the IFC have surveyed discriminatory laws across the world. And, along with discriminatory inheritance laws, there are countries that sanction the fact that women have to seek husbands' permission to travel, open up bank accounts, and so on. We have the unconscious biases and unruly practices and deliberate discrimination practiced by government officials. I think it was very evident in a statistic quoted in UN Women's latest report about the number of toilets that there are in the Delhi municipality, and it's like 300 for women and 2,000. I'm making those figures up, but it's that kind of disparity: 300 for women and 2,500 for men. Public toilets in the city of Delhi, and what does that mean for women vendors who must be out in the streets? And it does mean terrible kidney trouble and so on. So you've got all these unconscious biases, you've got active discrimination and unruly practices, which ensure that these so-called domestic inequalities, these domestic ideologies, are reproduced in the public domain. A number of other points about my theory of change is that there are these feedback mechanisms, and the way in which people who may not deliberately set out to discriminate as a rational response to structures. So for instance, parents may not want to discriminate against their daughters, but if they see that their daughters are going to earn much less in the marketplace than their sons, then they are likely to give their sons more education, a perfectly rational response, but one that is responding to given structures. So I call those the feedback mechanisms. Two other points is that we know that these structures of constraint, these cultural values, vary across the world. So in certain parts of the world, along with the primary responsibility for domestic care, there are very strong cultural restrictions on women's mobility in the public domain. And this has led to geographical variations in women's ability to participate in the marketplace, with South Asia and the MENA region still reporting the lowest female labor force participant rates in the world and the largest gender gaps. Secondly, apart from this geography of gender, the variation in inheritance practices, norms around public mobility, we know that there is variation across the life course. One could think of a stylized model of inequalities about how gender inequalities play out in childhood, in adolescence, in the working age group, and in old age. And there is a cumulative effect which leads to the fact that in old age, women are much more likely to be in poverty than men. And that is the product of accumulation of disadvantage across. And finally, we all know and realize and have to recognize that you cannot analyze gender in isolation from other inequalities in society. In every society, if at least class, but then there is race, ethnicity, indigeneity, religion, and so on, and location. So gender inequalities are constantly embedded within and intersecting with all other forms of social inequality in a society, and gender very often, not always, intensifies the disadvantages associated with these other forms of inequality. So, any kind of theory of change that wants to ask how livelihood capabilities can be built and to empower women must take on board a life course perspective. It must take on board the intersecting inequalities of a society, and it must take on board the geography of gender, which makes gender inequalities and structural disadvantage vary across the world. And so what I've just tried to do here is to remind us that that very basic linear model of change needs to be complicated. And basically, what we have to ask ourselves is, given these broader structures of constraint that may look different in different societies, to what extent can we assume that livelihood interventions actually translate into the resources that they are seeking to deliver? Do they actually reach the people? Do they manage to do anything at all? That's a question. Similarly, we have to ask ourselves, to what extent do the resources that if they manage to deliver them, do those translate into capabilities, into agency and achievable outcomes? That too is an empirical question. We cannot take it for granted. And when we're looking at agency and its exercise in trying to achieve valued outcomes, we may want to make a distinction between very practical outcomes, earning a bit more money, being able to send all your children to school and so on. And we may also want to ask, to what extent are these outcomes also strategic? Have they a political element to them? Do they touch on the structures of constraint in any way? Even if the only way they touch on it is by empowering women internally. even if all they do is to give a woman a sense that she is worth something rather than worth nothing. So for me, the empowerment element is when the exercise of agency leads to forms of change which may only operate at the subjective level, but is nevertheless absolutely critical for future change to happen. Obviously, subjective changes on their own are not going to change society, but they are important. So I've just got a few graphs here, and I won't go into them, just to remind you about the geography of gender, that you have these regional variations in labor force participation and the gender gaps. These gender gaps vary by age, with women most likely to have withdrawn from the labor market in their reproductive years, and the gaps are largest at that stage. The fact that inequalities, structural inequalities, intersecting inequalities mean that certain groups of men and women will be at the bottom of the occupational hierarchy, and that while poorer men and women are more likely to be in informal employment, women are most often found in more precarious, very much more vulnerable forms of work. Men may be found in more dirty, dangerous, and so on. But there are gender segmentations of opportunities, both in formal and informal labor markets. And of course, unemployment, higher amongst youth, and very many more women in the category of not either in employment nor in training, most likely doing unpaid work within the home. And amongst the elderly, we find that while in wealthier countries that have pensions, labor force participation goes on for much longer into old age amongst poorer countries. So let me now turn to what I would like to sort of focus on in this presentation, and that is, what does this literature that assesses different kinds of interventions for women, what does it tell us about the roadblocks to change? You know, what does it tell us about why interventions don't seem to work the way they do? First of all, as I said, we cannot assume that these interventions actually deliver the resources that they're supposed to deliver on. For instance, we know that even now, agricultural extension services continue to bypass many women farmers, and there are various reasons why. One may be that they are biased, that there's a generic bias against isolated farmers, and women tend to be overrepresented in that group. Two may be that there is a perception bias, that what women do is not regarded as real farming, or that the kind of crops they do don't count as agriculture. I gave the example of a colleague I worked with for many, many, many years in the Institute of Development Studies, who did research on Bangladesh. He was an English guy and a very nice guy, but he refused to believe that if you didn't grow rice, that you were a farmer. So in Bangladesh, it's men that grow rice, and that's all he was interested in. I told him women were now growing potatoes and vegetables, and he said, oh, poo-poo, that doesn't count. You know, only certain kinds of crops constitute real agriculture. So there are these biases, a bit odd, a bit irrational, but it has meant that agricultural extension services were not geared to women's farming activities. And then, of course, there is the sort of very male domination of these services, and the fact, and many male extension servants also reproduce these biases. I'm also interested in times. One would imagine that women farmers wanted services, agricultural services. But I'm also interested in examples where a livelihood intervention failed to translate into resources for its intended beneficiaries because they were perceived as irrelevant. And for that, I think there is a very good example in the form of a number of randomized control trials that were carried out in about 5 different locations, in urban neighborhood in India, in rural Morocco and Ethiopia, in rural and urban Mexico, and I think that was it. Oh, yes, Mongolia, rural Mongolia. And what was it? And it was intended to try and resolve some of the debates about the impacts of microfinance. You know, is it good, is it bad? The study came to the conclusion that the impacts of microfinance were modest, but very promising. But what I thought was very striking about the study was the rate of take-up. And the rate of take-up was extraordinarily low. It was like 17% in India, 18% in Ethiopia, 19% in somewhere else. The highest take-up was 50% in Mongolia. So although the study concluded that this shows that microfinance is not a panacea for, poverty reduction, etc., for me, it said that microfinance is largely irrelevant to large sections of these populations. So you are offering people an intervention that they're really not interested in. So very often, livelihood interventions fail to translate into resources because resources are not taken up. And resources are not taken up because nobody's interested in them. Let's then turn to examples where livelihood interventions have managed to reach the resources to their intended beneficiaries. Why do they then fail to translate into capabilities? And here I've identified about 4 reasons, or 4 broad explanations. One is what we might call initial conditions, and that is these intended beneficiaries, these participants, begin out with very different levels of assets and capabilities, and therefore their ability to take up, to benefit from this intervention is very uneven. And we see this time and time again in the literature around gender. So women farmers are not as able to act on agricultural extension services as men because they have, smaller plots, their plots are not so fertile, they don't have access to adult labor, they don't have the money to buy the inputs and so on. So, very obvious, this is a part of the inequalities that we start out with. It's also important to realize that these inequalities differentiate, create differences among women and among men. So for instance, let me see what example I can give. So for instance, when there was a policy to subsidize fertilizer in Malawi, one of the reasons why women farmers didn't adopt fertilizers to the same extent as men is precisely for the differences in these initial conditions, land, etc. But equally, certain male farmers were more likely to adopt fertilizer precisely because they had higher value plots than other men, because they were closer to the roads, because they had more access to adult labor than other men. And similarly amongst women, which women were more likely to adopt fertilizers? They were women who had received a coupon, and also women who had access to remittances, which compensated for their lack of cash. So these kind of initial conditions differentiate men and women, and differentiate men and women and women. We find the same story in enterprises, that women's enterprises tend to be smaller, less well capitalized, women have less experience, etc. So the story from the enterprise literature is the returns to women's enterprises are generally lower than those of men. And one other point, of course, is that, I'll come to the other point. The second point is around the gender division of unpaid labor. And that, of course, means that there are restrictions to the kinds of enterprises that women can take up. So women's choice of enterprises are much more likely to be determined by their poverty, by necessity, by the need to make money, but at the same time restricted by the fact that they have to reconcile their entrepreneurial work with their childcare responsibilities. And when you choose an enterprise out of necessity, the likelihood of a future growth trajectory is much lower. So a study in Mexico of female entrepreneurs found that those who were necessity-driven entrepreneurs, motivated by necessity, were far less likely to report growth in the long run than the minority of those women who had come into enterprise as a response to opportunity. Now, all of this means that efforts to promote livelihood interventions for men and women entrepreneurs, it's diluted by these disadvantages. So we find story after story of efforts to train women and men that report very poor results because of some of these kinds of constraints. The two two or three classic ones. The one from Sri Lanka is really interesting for me. So it was a randomized control trial that sought to provide transfers in cash and working capital to small-scale micro-entrepreneurs in Sri Lanka. They found that very soon men were reporting quite high levels of returns, and women were reporting zero. So women were much more likely to reinvest, to use their transfers, especially cash transfers, for their families. But even those that did invest their transfers reported very low returns. And the reasons appeared to be the kind of sectors and activities in which men and women were located. First of all, women were much more likely to be located from home, as we said earlier, and their customers were all within a very narrow range, whereas men were more likely to be presumably outside and had a much wider range of customers. Secondly, men and women were in very distinct activities. And the returns to the profitability of an activity was inversely related to the percentage of women in that activity. So the more women there were, the higher the percentage of women in an activity, the lower was the profitability. And therefore, when you had these transfers, women were trying to, if they did invest these transfers, they were trying to invest transfers in highly low return activities. The question then is, why don't women move into the higher? And there are these constraints we talked about, childcare, etc., but also norms that determined which kinds of activities were suitable for women. And they tended to be, I imagine, a much narrower range, so more women were crowded into these activities, and which kinds of activities were suitable for men. Similarly in Pakistan, attempts to provide training and so on to entrepreneurs in Pakistan came up against the same obstacles. Women much more likely to be within the home, men more likely to be outside. So I'm not sure why these efforts don't expect these results. When you've got these kinds of constraints, why would you not expect that there would be these huge gender differences in the impacts that these interventions could achieve? One slightly different result comes from Ghana, where a similar effort to provide transfers to male and female entrepreneurs, but a much wider range of entrepreneurs, found that although men reported higher returns, women at the higher end of the larger end of the enterprise scale actually did, at the 40% higher end, did report quite positive returns. In fact, their returns were higher than the average returns for men. And what were the reasons for that? Well, this is where the issue of class and positive initial conditions comes in. These were women that came obviously from better off families, that were better educated, that started out with larger enterprises, that had higher levels of education and access to profit. So there we see that the advantages that women had differentiated them both from the average male entrepreneurs, but also from poorer women. Another set of issues is, of course, which reinforces some of these constraints that we're talking about, is intra-household power dynamics. Who makes decisions about enterprises? Very often women report that they have very little decision-making power, they have very little time to spend on their enterprises, and very often these loans that they take are being used by men. A very interesting, again, one of these very revealing examples comes from Uganda, where an effort to, I can't remember if it was, I can't remember if it was loans, I think it was loans, found that once again, yet again, men reported higher profits than women. But here what was very interesting was the highest profits were reported by men who either lived with or near their families, because these men were able to mobilize adult family labor in their enterprises and therefore probably pay them less. The lowest profits were reported by women who lived with or near their families, because they were not able to mobilize the same kind of labor, and indeed their earnings were being absorbed by the demands of the family. And this was particularly true of married women relative to not married women. Now, these issues about the gender division of unpaid labor, intra-household power dynamics, all of these also affect women's ability to take up training. So even where women do enroll in training courses for business or whatever, you find high dropout rates and failure to complete. And they will cite family responsibilities or transport, distance and so on as the reasons for dropping out. Men do not cite these as reasons for dropping out. One other point I think that comes in when we're looking at these structures of constraint is what I think of holes in the opportunity structure. And that is, there is somehow an assumption that you provide an intervention and that once that intervention has been completed, that these people will go out there and find decent livelihoods. And this does not always happen. So there are interesting studies here as well, and the one I've selected is a program in Haiti for adolescent girls, which provided soft and hard skills and various kinds of training. And it found very positive impacts on the kind of cognitive and subjective fronts. The girls who went through this training were much more likely to be assertive in their relationships. They were much more likely to believe less likely to tolerate violent behavior within the family. All of those things changed. By the way, though, they did believe in shared responsibility for breadwinning, but they still believed that women were primarily responsible for unpaid care work. Where there was much less evidence of change was on the livelihoods front. So although this was meant as training to get girls out into the market, in fact, there was a reduction in employment, partly because some girls wanted to withdraw and do more training, perhaps get better jobs, but also because the market itself was highly depressed. There were no opportunities for these girls. And those that did try and manage to get some kind of opening were subjected to sexual harassment, demand for sexual favors. And many of them in the qualitative research said how devalued they felt, that in order to try and get a job, they were being asked to provide sexual favors, and the skills that they had received was not getting any recognition. I think another very interesting example of the problem of these opportunities, the lack of opportunities, comes from Sarah Baird's work in Malawi, where there were conditional cash transfers, for regular attendance, and those had quite positive impacts on girls who could afford to stay at school as a result of it and went on to, get good education. There were unconditional cash transfers, which were not tied to being in school, and which benefited those girls who had dropped out, they were too poor. And for the 2 years of the program, the evaluation found that there had been a reduction in, the age of marriage and age of childbearing, and in risky sexual behavior. But those effects lasted only as long as the program. So when they went back a couple of years later, they found that these very positive effects had disappeared. The girls had got married, often to men with lower cognitive skills. And as the authors of the report point out, in the absence of any other kind of opportunities, these are the only options available for these young women. So turning now to a slightly more positive set of lessons, what can we learn from this literature about pathways to change? What seems to have made a difference? What helped to translate resources into capabilities? And at some levels, it's kind of obvious, right? Why don't we tailor our efforts to promote women's capabilities and capital to reflect the various kinds of needs, constraints, demands, capacities? At a very simple level, this may mean paying for transport costs and additional childcare costs. So there are programs, for instance, a vocational training program in Colombia, which proved very effective for women, provided daily stipend to cover costs of transportation and lunch, with higher stipends for women with young children in recognition of these costs. A youth training program in Peru, which half of whose participants were women, had made special efforts to recruit them through the provision of childcare stipends to mothers with children under 5. Okay, so that's one. Just acknowledge that there are these additional costs that women have to encounter. And that, to me, is not rocket science. In Kenya, simplifying agricultural training manuals in order to take account of women's lower literacy had the effect of increasing women farmers' adoption of soil fertility replacement technologies compared to men. Elsewhere, there have been efforts to recruit more female extension agents, and a study by the World Bank and IFPRI, representatives of whom are here, found that female extension workers were more likely to reach out to women farmers. So in a very male-dominated extension services, having more women may make a difference. More radical changes, a move away from the top-down extension services to these farmer schools. And while they are often biased against poorer farmers, etc., Howard White in Wellington said they were likely to include women when implementers were actively encouraged to reach out to women. And a study of these farming schools from 3 African countries found that they had actually a greater impact on productivity of women's farms than men. And one reason for that might have been that men had many more options and were already engaged in other activities. Also, in vocational training programs in Latin America, many of these were demand-led, so that the trainers partnered with private sector institutions who then helped to shape the content of the training. And therefore, the skills that were provided to young men and women were skills that were in demand in the market. And these set of programs in Latin America proved fairly effective and actually often proved more effective to get women into jobs and into formal sector jobs than men. So there again, this time it was gearing the training to demand in the marketplace. There are other interesting things that come out about the training literature, and that is who is doing the training matters. So in India, NGO trainers who've been working with self-help groups for a long time proved to be much better trainers than government officials who were now trying to start up self-help groups, and that's not a big surprise. In Tanzania, I mean, again, it's not rocket science, is it? So in Tanzania, university trainers proved to be more effective in training microfinance clients than the microfinance staff who they try to train. So there's a difference in professionalism and experience, which makes a difference. Then there's the content of the training. So in Latin America, it seemed like the on-the-job placements may have been more effective than the classroom training. Elsewhere, it may have been that the technical training provided was more important than the generalized training in other places. So the content of the training matters. And there's a very, very good article by a woman called Smita Radhakrishnan in World Development, which has done one of the few articles that I've seen that have opened up the black box of training. You know, this training stuff is like a black box. You're told how many days, how intensive, but you're not told anything more about it. And she studies an effort to transfer lessons learned from training entrepreneurs in Latin America via Washington to India. And once it got to India and then had to be implemented by, street level or group level trainers, it bore no resemblance and it had no relevance to the local context. And I really feel that when we want to understand the effectiveness of training, we really have to open up that black box and find out what kind of trainer, what is being taught, and so on and so forth. In terms of financial services for the poor, I'm going to make a huge leap to generalize, to say that comparing group versus individual, I prefer group-based approaches, and I say that on the basis of what I've read. And amongst group, I think that the self-help, the savings and lending group approach is far more responsive to the needs of poor women than the Grameen-style joint liability group. Now, there's a little diagram there from India, overview of these different models, and as it tells you, individual banking is far less likely to reach women. It's far less likely to reach poor women, and it's far less likely to reach women from the poorest castes and tribes. Self-help group models, the saving and lendings model, are far more likely to reach women who target women, far more likely to reach poorer people, and far more likely to reach the excluded groups. Moreover, there is research to tell us, and Natalie Holvert has done this, comparing impact on decision-making within the household. And we find that individual lending has far less impact on decision-making power within the household, and the kind of group matters. So organizations like Pradhan, and I don't know why I'm pointing to you, but Pradhan and Mairada, who took group dynamics seriously, are much more likely to have these kinds of impacts. And if we go back to that randomized control trial, the one where nobody wanted the microfinance, Mongolia was the most successful. It had 50 to 57% take-up. And it was the group lending, that was 57%, and the individual lending, that was 50%. And the group lending was much more likely to result in female-dominated enterprises, while the individual lending was much more likely to be appropriated by male-dominated enterprises. So somewhere I think we have to bear in mind that never mind the wealthier women and the moderate, all that, for poorer women and marginalized groups, these group dynamics is a very important way of promoting access to finance. And secondly, if we look at the evaluations of joint liability versus self-help group models, it is very interesting that very few evaluations of joint liability groups ask questions beyond the individual and to some extent the economic. So it will be about individual decision-making, bargaining power, it will be about economics and so on. It's when we look at the evaluations of self-help groups that we start to also see an attempt to look at political impacts and wider impacts. And it is also the case that evaluations of self-help groups find these impacts. They find that self-help groups are much more likely to take collective action about issues that matter to them, practical issues like water, and political issues like male violence. It is also true there's more likely to be spillover effects within communities in which these self-help groups function. So for a number of reasons, I myself, I'm a big fan of these savings-led rather than credit-led savings and livelihoods. Attempts to provide wage labor for women, wage labor for the poor, have often taken the form of public works programs, and they've not been, they're notoriously male-biased. But there are a number of examples that suggest that they do not have to be so biased. And one set of studies comes from Argentina, and the other from India. India, of course, has one of the largest public works programs. And there are a number of features to the Indian program, the National Rural Guarantee Scheme, which provides wage employment if enough people demand it. It has a 30% quota for women. It requires creches wherever there are at least 5 women working on it. The work must be provided within a close radius of people's homes. There's provision for auditing. There's the right to information. That means all information must be made public. Now, all of this obviously doesn't happen, right? But it should happen. And the fact that it ought to happen has a mobilizing impact. Civil society does mobilize to demand that people get paid their wages and the information is provided. And the evaluations of the impact of participating in the national rural tells us that it does also have the kind of impacts you expect for, more girls going to school and so on. The other interesting thing of both Argentina and India is the extent to which, a high proportion of women participated, high proportion of women who were not economically active before participated, and a high proportion of women expressed their preference for working on government programs rather than having to negotiate with, the kind of private contractors, etc., that poorer women would have to deal with. So there was something about being on a government program where the rules are much more predictable than having to deal with private landlords and private contractors. And secondly, a sense of doing something about community service, which I think made it appealing or acceptable for women to be involved. I wouldn't generalize too far on that, okay, but those are the things. Affordable childcare, obviously, and Latin America has made huge progress on this, but we've seen it in China and Mozambique, and where it's made available, it has increased women's ability to take up labor force, to take up employment. Multi-stakeholder initiatives to labor codes in global value chains over private codes of conduct. And I'm talking here about the Better Works program. Tufts University has been monitoring and evaluating it, and the early results are extremely positive, including a reduction in sexual harassment in Vietnam, greater willingness to report it, and so on. I'm now talking faster because my time is up. And finally, multi-component approaches. And interestingly, there's one which is the BRAC transfer, asset transfer program to the very poor, which transfers assets but combines it with the consumption stipend and training support and so on. But some of the more successful ones have been with adolescents and with adolescent girls. And somehow these programs seem to acknowledge to a much larger extent the multiple and overlapping nature of the kinds of constraints that young girls and women have to put up with. And particularly one in Uganda has been extremely successful in achieving impacts on the subjective, the cognitive, and to some extent the practical. So those kinds of things I think are very important. But I also want to conclude with, I don't know how much I can conclude with, but all of these are about individual recipients, beneficiaries, right? People who are a part of a project and with a bit of luck, spillover effects. But we want something that goes beyond the individuals. So what are the kinds of lessons we can draw for an enabling environment? Well, one is institutional learning. And my big problem with some of these experiments is they are very short-term. They don't allow a project or a program to grow roots and learn. So institutional learning, I think there's a phrase here called iterative, adaptive learning. And I think, if we look at the Pradhan and Myrada and BRAC, these have been along for a long time, and they have learned. Secondly, structural responses to time and mobility constraints, and that is infrastructure, utilities, etc. Electricity, running water, water taps near you, roads, transportation, all of these can make a huge difference to the unpaid productive and reproductive activities that take up so much of women's time. Solidarity, we've talked about self-help groups, but across the world, women coming together, and I think the minister talked about this as well, are a force for change. If we have had change so far, yes, there have been some enlightened men, etc., but it has been the power of women's movements, autonomous women's movements very often, but around what has been called the doctrinal issues, or the body politics, and in alliance with trade unions and others around the politics of redistribution, around wages and so on. States can make things worse and they can make things better. And we know of a number of policies and legislations. Simplifying registration of enterprises allows women to formalize their enterprises. Minimum wages benefits those at the very bottom, very often women. A law in Argentina that legalized part-time work for women made it possible for many mothers to enter into formal employment. A law in Morocco around family codes has increased the capacity of young women to. So this is not just about projects, this is about, the larger environment, and of course, the structure of opportunities. And that is a struggle we hear again and again. How do we change the macroeconomic policies in order to put employment at the center? Because many of the positive accounts that we have are very dependent on whether there are opportunities available, just as many of the negative accounts we hear are because there were no opportunities available. So finally, 3 points. The importance, and we've talked about this earlier, of being sure we're measuring what we think we're measuring, and of making a distinction between what is a means to an end and what is an end in itself. So, a lot of this business training, it seems to, the generalization is they improve women's business skills, but they don't increase their profits. So we have to ask, what is blocking? Business skills are great, wonderful, but you want them in order to get better business. So what is blocking the translation of business skills into higher profits? So we need to measure, we need to be sure. Secondly, how do we know what drives change? And this, of course, is, as people know here, my big complaint with randomized control trials is they tell us changes happen, but they don't often tell us how it happened, why it happened. So we're left with this kind of, what? And can it happen again? Can we do it somewhere else? And what is missing from the empowerment agenda so far? And I'm going to take at least 1 minute for this, I'm sorry. What is missing from the empowerment agenda so far is something that really came home to me after the research that I've been doing in Bangladesh, as we're writing it up, and the qualitative research. And that is, if the Me Too movement has spotlighted the extent of sexual harassment that women have to put up with in the workplace, then the studies from South Asia, and perhaps in other parts of the world, but I will stick to South Asia, tell us that sexual harassment curtails women's life chances right across the life course. So from harassment at school by your fellow students or by teachers, to harassment on the streets, to harassment in universities, so that girls will drop out of good colleges and good potential careers because of, and you know, in Bangladesh, if a man gets turned down, he often throws acid at a woman. So, you know, that's his. So harassment, then about work. And we found that a lot of the reasons why women choose one form of work rather than another and work at home rather than outside is the fear of sexual harassment. And the fear of sexual harassment is as crippling as the, it's not as crippling, it can be pretty crippling. And the fact, okay, my work is quality. This, our survey shows 30% harassment amongst women who work outside the home. So that's not, I mean, you know. But one study that I've just been sent from India tells me that this is not a purely, you know, qualitative, limited finding. And that study tells us that the likelihood of women being in the labor force is strongly related to the perceived harassment of young girls within their community. So, and this is using national data of India, and it is telling us something very important, that women's economic empowerment is unlikely to go very far if this issue of sexual harassment is not taken very seriously. And that, of course, tells us about the other thing that is missing, is how does one change the behavior of men? Okay, thank you.
Great. So we have, thank you very much. That was really wonderful. Well, I'll have you come back here in a second.
Okay.
We have a few minutes. Maybe we'll take 2 or 3 very short questions, and I'll let you field them. Maybe we'll take the 3 questions and then. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Kabeer, for sharing your work with us. I'm sitting here. Should I stand up?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, hi. So my question is about women's livelihoods in general and not so much about the interventions that you spoke about. But in your opinion, and like we hear, at least I've been hearing this refrain constantly that jobs are going to disappear, work is going to disappear because of AI, because of this, because of that. So in your opinion, is this a legitimate threat to women's livelihoods right now, or what kind of interaction do you envision between the two as we, in the future? Does this kind of like technological change have any role or space within the theory of change that you just told us about? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for that. I really enjoyed your talk. So my question had to do with this aspect you identified about the subjective agency of women. And it raised a question for me about conflicts of subjective affirmation. So women who are socialized into certain kinds of structural constraints nevertheless develop self-esteem and recognition by, you know, being sort of finding ways of getting that from the system. And they can often feel threatened when, you know, new kinds of social structures and opportunities exist that perhaps they are not skilled enough to be able to exploit. And this then causes, I think, a lack of solidarity, and sometimes it's class-based and, you know, other forms. So I'm just wondering if you find that in studies, and how can that be addressed? Because then, you know, there can be different kinds of structural barriers that would need to be addressed, I think.
Thank you. Between being a man and having worked for 20 years in a development agency, I feel doubly hammered by, I think, what are very reasonable conclusions from your research. And not to blindly promote part of the Government of Canada's solution, but the question to you is, do you think if we really deepen the capacity to do gender-based analysis plus, so gender-based plus intersectional analysis at the outset of designing and implementing these programs, that we could start to tackle some of these, what are unfortunately inadvertent effects?
Technology, I'm afraid I would not be able to give you a very informed answer to that. All I know is that, this is something that is in the air, and the ILO's got a big thing on the future of work, and the kinds of jobs that are going to be, robotized or mechanized or whatever, are going to perhaps hit women because they will be those kinds of jobs. But beyond that, I have not read anything. I have not heard it. I've seen a few blogs, so I really couldn't give you a very informed answer on that. I'm sorry. I think your question is really a very good one, because it's, in fact, I think I raised it in our session this morning, and that is, I think of it as a status versus autonomy tension. That many of the things that you might look for in your life, you can get through conforming to what a proper woman, how she behaves, has lots of sons, etc., etc. So there is that tension, and it does create divisions, because not all women can conform to these kinds of high status norms. And that is why I think when you look for interventions that, change-oriented interventions, you're really looking for those kinds of people that are most open to change. So, for instance, if you look at organizations that mobilize in the countryside, they will have organizations, groups, etc., and the people who will join them are the people who want change, rather than those who prefer. And yes, they will be threatened by the kinds of changes, but nobody said this process was going to be a smooth and easy one. It will involve internal divisions and dissensions, and amongst women as well as others. And you were asking about the design of policies. I think it's about the design, the implementation, the monitoring, the feedback. So I think something has to go all the way along rather than just getting it right at the design level. I also think and this is not about donors, it's about governments, it's about NGOs, etc. I think we often forget to pay attention to the quality of the people responsible for delivery, if you like. It's that interface between, that actor-oriented interface between, at the village level, at the coalface. The people who are involved in that are the people that can make the big difference. So that example of training being, sort of transferred from Latin America via Washington to India, what they forgot is really what mattered were the trainers in India, because they're the ones that were going to be doing the training. And no matter how perfect the module you developed, if the trainers had not understood the purpose of the training, you won't. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think we need to start paying attention, not just to getting the design right, but to incentivizing the people responsible all the way along the policy process to also get it right. How does one motivate them, not just necessarily through performance-related indicators, but how does one inculcate that sense of service and commitment and, that kind of thing.
We have one last question, if you can grab the microphone. Oh, okay, two last questions, very short, please. Yeah.
Hello? Okay. So my last question is referring to your last reflection on what's missing from the women's empowerment agenda. So this kind of also goes on your last answer as well on the differences between cultures, between nationhoods, between values of a society, and how that plays into women's empowerment. I work with young Indigenous women in Canada, and a lot of the notions that you spoke about hit to it, but also lack in it. How does a government, how does an international movement not leave certain identities behind?
Thank you very much. It's always nice to hear you, Naila. And I don't know whether you could shed a light on, how you, if you look back into your thinking, because you have nurtured so much, this field of, gender equality in terms of conception. And from my practice, what I've seen, when we talk about intersections, one element sometimes dominates the other, which might be class and race, and not sex. And that has such an impact in so many areas. If you look into the progress we accomplished over the years, it has benefit from my part of the world, mostly to most educated women through the laws. In Senegal, for instance, you have the 50-50 gender laws that put women into parliament. That wasn't the poorest that get there. That was the middle class. When we look into the progress in education, it also touched women from rural areas. So would you rethink that intersection and sort of pull what are the most important aspect of oppression, which is not necessarily just being a woman, but it's most of the time being a poor citizen. What I'm leading at is what we are looking now, a very disempowered individual that might be man, sometimes oppressed by opulent women, or you would have also well-to-do women oppressing very poor women, and that's what we see in many places. Look into women's working in households and being paid. All of that made me think that we need to reconceptualize sort of the intersection and see what are the nail we need to hit, to get where we want to get. Because as we speak, the progress are being captured by the most well-to-do women and not necessarily the poorest. And that's what drives allocation of budget that doesn't necessarily go to the poorest, but yet we are not catching up with the thinking. So the last point is, do you see, sort of in terms of research, sort of a modeling of what we need to do in terms of progress? You're leading into, do we need to invest in economic empowerment? Do we need to invest in law? By the way, in your model, I'm sure you thought about it, but culture is something that really need to come into your model, because it completely changed, the situation in many cases. Do we need to sort of make progress in lands? And if we put it together, what type of modeling can we offer to decision makers? And that's the key question in finance-constrained environment, where you need to make choices. But one choice might impact millions of people or might not. So that's where we're looking up to researchers to tell us.
Well, I'll be very quick, because I think we have to wrap up. Well, first of all, I think, we're all aware that, powerful women are in have a degree of power over less powerful men. That's true. I think my understanding of the way that I look at intersecting inequalities is that for any group of disadvantaged people, women tend to be at a greater disadvantage. So that doesn't mean that there are not powerful women, but all along, whether one looks at the intersection of race, class, and gender in Brazil or wherever, you will find the most disadvantaged women at the bottom. And that seems to be a generalization that I can live with, I can support. Secondly, I think it is absolutely true that many of the progress has benefited those very powerful women who have set the agenda. And one of the things about women is that you have them right across the class structure, and obviously elite women have been able to prioritize what they want in Bangladesh, in India, in Senegal, or whatever. But I don't believe in a model is going to give us the answer, what is the strategic thing. It's going to. But there are lessons that we can kind of pull on. One is that I'm finding, again, looking at evidence from India, that decentralization and quotas have helped a lot of very poor women. That having quotas for women at the local level rather than at the national level, and these local level women may not be the poorest, but the fact that they are in closer proximity to very poor women seems to have some very, very interesting and positive results. And if they continue, we might see a transformation of India, in our lifetime. And the other one is that donors have stopped funding the kinds of organizations, women's organizations, landless organizations, that would undertake a redistributive agenda at the very bottom. And I think, this is something that women's organizations have been talking about, AWID has been talking about. The scope for civil society activism by feminists who are interested in working at the grassroots level has closed down or has shrunk a lot. So at the moment, I'll tell you, decentralization and, women's rights movements at the grassroots level will try and help to, bring some of those benefits of progress further down the ladder. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Naila, for a wonderful talk. Thank you.